The cold air cut sharply through the barren landscape, a constant reminder of the harshness that surrounded the military base. The sky was a steel-gray expanse, stretched thin over the icy runway where fighter jets stood like silent sentinels. The wind howled, dragging flurries of snow across the tarmac in violent gusts, cutting through everything it touched. Inside, the environment was no warmer, with the hum of heating units mingling with the mechanical sounds of aircraft being prepared for mission. In this isolated world, Jessie sat in her small telemetry station, tucked between a radar shack and a frozen water tower. Her workstation was modest at best, with papers and charts scattered across the small desk, a well-worn mechanical pencil resting just within reach. She glanced out the window, watching the figures of pilots and crew members move in and out of the hangar, their voices barely audible over the buzz of the overhead lamp that flickered. Above her, despite being surrounded by the chaotic energy of the base, Jessie felt an unsettling calmness. No one seemed to notice her presence as they moved in and out of their high-stakes routines. The pilots, dressed in their flight suits, passed by her station without so much as a glance. Their laughter and casual banter filled the air, but none of it was directed toward her. Jessie had long since stopped expecting any acknowledgement. She was part of the background noise, an invisible entity performing tasks no one really cared about. To them, she was nothing more than a nameless cog in the machine, just another face. Behind the screen, the station itself was small, with peeling edges on the papers she worked with, the charts meticulously organized yet frequently ignored. Her task was simple: to record and analyze thermal scatter data. But the work felt endless, a never-ending cycle of input and output, unnoticed by the pilots who were far too busy with their own jobs. The charts on her desk were updated with data no one else seemed to value. The thermal signatures she monitored and analyzed were crucial for the success of the operation, yet they would likely be forgotten the moment the mission was over. Despite the apparent lack of recognition, Jessie kept at her work, every motion deliberate, every analysis calculated. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the fleeting notion of being seen, but it was quickly dismissed. She couldn't afford such distractions. There was a mission to be done. Outside, the wind intensified, rattling the thin windows of her station. She could hear the muted voices of the pilots and crew inside the hangar, but it was as if they were a world apart from her. Jessie let out a soft sigh, the weight of solitude pressing down on her chest. She had been here for months, performing the same tasks day after day, each one just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. There was no glory, no recognition, just the quiet, diligent work that kept everything running. And yet, something inside her kept her going, a quiet sense of duty. She had learned long ago that her place wasn't to be in the spotlight. She was the one who ensured that everything worked in the background, even if no one ever knew she existed. Her fingers paused briefly as she ran through another set of scatterwave anomalies. The data was noisy, as expected, with plenty of synthetic interference designed to test pilot response times. But Jessie noticed something in the pattern. Something subtle, a flicker, an anomaly that didn't fit with the rest of the data. It was almost too faint to catch, but to her, it stood out like a beacon in the dark. She didn't have time to analyze it further. The mission would likely proceed, without anyone ever considering it. Still, she made a note of it, circling the irregular data points with her pencil. Even if no one noticed her efforts, she would continue to do the work. Jessie's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps passing by her door, a reminder that life outside her station continued on without her. She glanced up momentarily, watching as one of the pilots, helmet under arm, walked toward the briefing room. The sounds of the base grew louder as the pilots gathered, ready for the mission ahead. But Jessie remained in her place, as always the silent observer, the unnoticed worker. A part of her longed to be more than this, but she had learned to accept it. This was her role, and no matter how often she was overlooked, she would do it to the best of her ability. She returned to her charts, her mind sharp despite the isolation. The wind outside continued to howl, and the base seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next operation to begin. Inside, however, the work was already underway, and Jessie knew her part in it would remain just as it had always been: quiet, unremarkable, and essential. It didn't matter if anyone noticed. She would keep working, because it was what she was meant to do. Jessie sat silently at the back of the briefing room, her name now absent from the active flight list displayed on the digital board. It was a quiet removal, unspoken yet deeply felt. The colonel had made the call without fanfare, as if it was a small administrative detail, and she had been reassigned to a support role: thermal scatter data logging, the same job she had been doing for months. No explanation, no apology, just a subtle nod toward the new task she was expected to fulfill. As the pilots shuffled in, their voices lively with banter. She could sense the shift. Her participation in the mission had been deemed unnecessary, but her role in the mission's success was still undeniable to her. She knew it, even if no one else did. The room was filled with the usual chaos of pre-mission prep. Officers milled around, adjusting their gear and reviewing final checklists. The pilots joked amongst themselves, their voices loud and familiar, echoing off the sterile walls of the briefing room. Jessie watched as they settled into their positions, eyes briefly flickering over her, before turning away. Focused on the operation at hand, she stood behind them, clutching her clipboard, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. She was used to this by now. The quiet indifference of her peers. The colonel, sharp as ever in his flight suit, quickly launched into the mission briefing, outlining the objectives for the intercept drill. As he spoke, the pilots around her shifted their attention, their eyes fixed on the operational details, while Jessie remained a quiet observer. "Weather's clear for today?" Colonel Rohr's voice echoed, cutting through the chatter. "We'll have overlapping intercept sectors. Make sure we hit the thermal decoys exactly as planned. No room for mistakes." He scanned the room, pausing briefly to glance at the telemetry team. His eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on Jessie, before moving on without a word. "Some pilots are built for tempo, some for spreadsheets," he added with a half smile. The room filled with polite laughter, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that meant anything. It wasn't for Jessie. She knew it. They knew it. Her role was small now, just another part of the technical operation. She had been relegated to a job that didn't demand much an observer from the shadows, recording data that no one would likely read. As the briefing continued, Jessie felt the distance between herself and her colleagues grow. She had no part in this mission, nothing more than a bystander to the actions of others. The pilots were the ones who would engage, the ones who would be in the spotlight. And yet, as they discussed tactics and training schedules, Jessie could not shake the feeling that she had something to contribute, something that had been ignored. She had been working on the telemetry charts for months, studying the heat patterns, learning the intricacies of the system. But here she was, pushed to the sidelines, with no one bothering to ask her opinion. It wasn't just the dismissive remarks that stung, it was the subtle way she was erased. One of the pilots, a young lieutenant, joked with his peers about how he'd prefer the weather to stay as is, ignoring the fact that the telemetry data had just confirmed an anomaly in the eastern quadrant. Jessie had noticed it, but no one cared about the data she brought to the table. Her report, filed meticulously as always, went unread, as it always did. The lieutenant's laugh echoed in her ears as she sat there, isolated in a room full of people. She wanted to speak up, to challenge them, but the words stuck in her throat. They would never listen. They never did. The briefing finally ended, and the pilots stood, ready to begin their respective missions. Jessie remained seated, feeling the weight of their indifference press down on her. She glanced at the empty seat beside her, the one that had once held her name on the flight roster, now vacant. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard, the only sign of her frustration. She knew the mission needed the telemetry data she had painstakingly gathered, yet it felt as if it had no real weight in the grand scheme of things. She wasn't part of the action. She wasn't important. As the pilots filed out of the room, ready to board their aircraft, Jessie followed them in silence. She watched as they suited up, their movements brisk and assured, each one confident in the importance of their role. The mechanics and crew chiefs moved efficiently around them, checking weapons, performing final maintenance. The hum of engines starting up filled the air, and Jessie stood there, at the periphery, her clipboard still clutched in her hands. No one looked her way. No one asked if the data was ready. If the charts were correct, it didn't matter. The pilots would fly without her. They always did. She walked back to her station, the quiet hum of the base surrounding her. The wind outside had picked up again, rattling the thin windows of her shed. Inside, the air was stale, and the sound of the heater cycling through its intermittent buzz made her feel even more isolated. She sat at her desk, the cold pressing against the glass, and pulled up the data once more. But it felt pointless now, as if her work was a mere formality. The mission was already set in motion, with or without her. The recognition would never come. And perhaps that was what she had to accept. But somewhere beneath the disappointment, something inside her burned quietly. A flicker of frustration, yes, but also a drive. Jessie knew her worth, even if no one else did. And somehow, that quiet knowledge would keep her going. Even if no one acknowledged it, she could feel the weight of her role in the mission. Even if she wasn't part of the action, even if she was the one who stayed behind. Jessie knew that her contributions mattered whether they were recognized or not. She would continue to do the work, because it was what she was meant to do. Jessie sat alone in the small telemetry station, the low hum of the equipment her only company. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, marking the passage of time in a way that made the minutes feel long and drawn. Out. The room was dim, the light from her monitor casting faint shadows across the walls. Outside, the Arctic wind screamed against the metal walls of the base, but inside, it was calm, too calm. She focused intently on the screen in front of her, scrolling through the radar data, analyzing the thermal scatter reports. The mission was in full swing, and the pilots were out in the field, engaged in the intercept drill. But Jessie's job was different. She wasn't in the sky with them. She wasn't on the front lines. She was here, behind the scenes, analyzing the data that would guide their next move. As her eyes scanned the data, something caught her attention, a faint anomaly hidden in the noise. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable among the expected patterns of decoys and simulated threats. The thermal signature didn't quite match the rest of the data. The irregularity was small, but Jessie's trained eye immediately recognized it. It was a heat signature too controlled to be a standard weather anomaly or a thermal ghosting designed for the drill. It was different. It was real, a stealth-class contact, slipping past the radar net undetected. Her fingers moved automatically to pull up the system's filtering tools, her mind already running through a checklist of potential explanations. The signature was too clean, too precise for a typical decoy. She toggled through the filters, narrowing the data to the specific frequency range. But the signature didn't disappear. Instead, it persisted, almost as if the anomaly was tracking a pattern, evading detection with careful precision. Ghost targets, simulated by the drill, usually vanished after a few seconds. But this one was persistent. It was mimicking the signature of a real aircraft. Yet it wasn't registering as one. No ID tag, no ping, no friendly transponder echoes. Jessie's pulse quickened. She wasn't supposed to be in charge of monitoring these types of anomalies. Her job was just to log the data to ensure everything was within expected parameters. But this was different. She ran another cross-check with the previous logs, pulling up the heat signatures from earlier in the week. Her eyes darted across the screen, comparing timestamps, cross-referencing coordinates. There it was again, the same faint discrepancy, appearing in the same location. It wasn't a fluke. It was something real, and no one had noticed. The sudden realization sent a wave of urgency through her. The mission was happening right now, and she had just discovered something that could be a threat to the operation. But no one would listen to her. No one had listened to her before. She knew this. She was just the analyst, the one who crunched the numbers. The pilots were the ones who flew, the ones who got the glory. But as she stared at the data, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something big was slipping past them, unseen. A pattern was emerging, something that was being missed by everyone else. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. She had no official role in this part of the operation. Her job was to observe, to record, not to act. But something inside her burned with the need to act. This wasn't just another data point to be filed away and forgotten. This could be the edge they needed. Jessie quickly compiled a detailed report of the anomaly, outlining the data points, thermal scatter information, and her analysis of the irregularity. Her report was methodical, as always, clear and concise. She added a note about the unusual consistency of the signature, marking it for further investigation. Still, she knew her report would likely be overlooked. The system would log it, but it would be buried under a pile of other data. The pilots would return, the drill would end, and everything would go back to normal. But something in Jessie's gut told her that this time was different. She sent the report to Central Command, hoping someone, anyone, would take a second look. She didn't expect a response, but she had to try. There was no way she could ignore this. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen as the radar scan continued. The anomaly persisted, now more distinct than before. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't an error. It was a real threat, one that had slipped past the net unnoticed. Jessie's mind raced as she considered her options. She could follow the data, monitor the movements of the stealth-class contact herself. But she had no authority to act. If she raised an alarm now, she would be risking her job, her reputation, and the credibility of her analysis. But if she didn't act, if she let this go unnoticed, and something happened, the blame would fall squarely on her shoulders. The conflict gnawed at her, but in the end, there was only one choice. Jessie checked the time, 13:45. The intercept drill was about to reach its final phase. She couldn't sit back and do nothing. She knew the risks, but she also knew what was at stake. If she was wrong, she would be reprimanded. If she was right, though, she would have saved the operation. With a deep breath, She sent another advisory request, marking the anomaly with the highest priority. She knew it might be dismissed, but this time, there was no other option. She had to speak up. She had to make sure someone else saw it before it was too late. The silence of the station was broken only by the faint tap of her fingers on the keyboard. Outside, the wind howled, a constant reminder that the world was moving forward with or without her. But Jessie's world, at that moment, was consumed by the anomaly on the screen. It was a quiet discovery, one that no one else had seen, but it was enough to change the course of the operation. She sat back, her eyes fixed on the screen. The thermal signature continued to drift, unchallenged and undetected by anyone else. Jessie knew she had just taken the first step into a role that she had longed for but never thought she'd be able to play. This was her moment to prove that she wasn't just the observer, she was a key part of the mission. The weight of her discovery hung heavily in the air as the clock ticked on. Jessie walked toward the flight line, the cold biting through her jacket as the wind swept across the tarmac. The air was frigid, sharp with the scent of metal and jet fuel, and the sky above was an unbroken sheet of gray. She moved with purpose, her boots crunching against the frosted concrete, a soft rhythm that contrasted with the thunderous hum of engines starting up. Around her, there was a moment of hesitation, a brief flicker of doubt, but she pushed it aside. This was not a decision she was going to second-guess. She had already been dismissed, her role relegated to a support task that no one cared about. But what had just happened, what she had seen on the radar, was far too important to ignore. She couldn't let it go. Not now. Not when she was the only one who saw the danger. Her eyes locked on the F-15E, one of the planes sitting idle, prepped for an emergency but not currently assigned to the mission. It was a fighter jet that had seen plenty of action, but today, it was just another aircraft, gathering dust on the flight line. No one had given it a second thought. Jessie walked past the crew chiefs, who were busy with other aircraft, and made her way directly to the ladder leaning against the F-15E's side. No one stopped her. They didn't even look up. It was as if she was invisible to them, which, in many ways, she had become. She grabbed the ladder with a firm grip and pulled herself up into the cockpit, her movements precise, practiced. She had done this before, though never under these circumstances. This time, there was no instructor beside her, no one telling her where to adjust the throttle or how to line up the instruments. This time, it was all on her. Inside the cockpit, the air was colder than she expected. It smelled of old leather and synthetic materials, with a faint residue of jet fuel that clung to the interior. She adjusted the seat, ensuring the harness was tight and secure before flipping the switches to power up the aircraft's systems. The cold metal of the cockpit panels was comforting in a way, grounding her as she ran through the pre-flight checks. First, the primary flight display came to life, flashing briefly before settling into its standby mode. She checked the systems, her fingers moving over the switches with the ease of someone who knew the aircraft well. The F-15E was an advanced fighter, and its systems were complex. But Jessie had spent enough time studying the manuals and running simulations to understand its every detail. The engine started with a low growl, the vibrations from the powerful twin engines vibrating through the cockpit. She felt the shift in the aircraft's weight as it powered up, the noise growing louder as the turbines kicked into gear. Her hands moved methodically, checking each system. Fuel flow normal, hydraulic pressure stable, engine status green. Everything was falling into place. Her eyes flicked between the various instruments, ensuring that every gauge, every display was in the right range. This wasn't the first time she had prepared an aircraft for flight, but it was the first time she had done it without clearance, without anyone telling her it was okay. The moment the engine fired, the weight of the decision settled in. She knew the risks. She knew she was acting outside the chain of command. If she was caught, there would be consequences, likely severe. But what choice did she have? The anomaly she had discovered wasn't just a glitch. It was real. And if it slipped past the net without someone acting, it could have catastrophic consequences. No one else had seen it. And the thought of sitting back and waiting for the drill to finish without doing anything was unbearable. The jet systems settled into their usual rhythm, and Jessie adjusted the trim on the flight controls, calibrating them to her preferences. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling against the cockpit, but she barely noticed. Her focus was complete. She switched the comms over to the local tower, but no one responded. She was off the radar, in a sense isolated. A quick glance at the radar display confirmed what she already knew. The flight path was clear. The base was still in its operational window. She was alone in the cockpit, and that was exactly how she needed it to be. No one was watching. No one would stop her. With a soft push on the throttle, the F-15E lurched forward, its engines roaring to life as the jet began to roll down the runway. The jet's immense power surged beneath her, and the vibrations rattled through her bones. But Jessie remained calm, her hands steady on the controls. She was not a novice. She had been trained for this. Even if the training had been theoretical, she adjusted the speed, keeping the aircraft on course as she guided it toward the edge of the airstrip. The cold wind cut through the small gaps in the canopy, but inside the cockpit, it was a controlled chaos, a perfectly orchestrated dance of power and precision. As the jet climbed into the sky, Jessie felt the weight of the decision shift inside her. She was no longer just a background player. She was in command of this situation, and she had no intention of backing down. The F-15E climbed steadily, its nose pointed toward the open sky. The instruments blinked in the low light, and she watched as the horizon expanded before her. She was above it all, but at the same time, her actions had set something in motion that could change the course of the entire operation. The silence of the flight was broken only by the steady hum of the engines, the rush of wind outside the cockpit, and the soft beeps of the radar screen. She checked her flight path, adjusting as necessary to stay clear of the base's restricted zones. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't from fear. It was the thrill of doing something no one else had the courage to do. Her instincts told her that she was on the right track. The radar, as usual, showed no signs of activity, but the anomaly was still out there, just beyond the reach of conventional detection. With each passing moment, Jessie's confidence grew. The plane responded to her touch, every maneuver precise and controlled. She wasn't just flying, she was proving something to herself, something that had been buried beneath months of disregard. She had done the work, she had found the anomaly, and now, she was going to finish it. Finish what no one else had seen. She was the one who had noticed, and she was the one who would take action, even if it meant breaking the rules to do so. Her hands gripped the controls tighter as she maneuvered the jet into position, her eyes scanning the horizon. The thrill of defiance surged through her. But it wasn't the rush of rebellion. It was the satisfaction of knowing she had made the right choice, no matter the cost. Jessie's eyes narrowed as she fixed her gaze on the radar screen. The faint blip she had been tracking for the past hour had finally shifted into a more defined, consistent pattern. It wasn't a mistake, a malfunction, or a decoy. It was an unknown aircraft, and it was maneuvering with purpose, as if it knew it was being watched. She could feel the weight of the moment settle over her as the F-15E hummed. Beneath her, the sky ahead was still and calm, a sharp contrast to the tension building inside the cockpit. She adjusted her flight path slightly, moving the F-15E into a wide arc, staying just outside the range of the unknown aircraft's radar. Her altitude was set just below the terrain masking threshold, high enough to remain undetected but low enough to stay within the cover of the land below. The terrain here, with its jagged cliffs and narrow valleys, provided perfect concealment. She skimmed the jagged ridges, staying low and steady as she kept her eyes on the unknown target. The horizon was clear, but every time she checked her instruments, the signature of the aircraft remained, stubbornly refusing to disappear. Jessie's fingers adjusted the throttle slightly, increasing her speed to close the gap between herself and the target. The F-15E responded with a subtle lurch, its engines roaring as it gained speed. She didn't push the jet to its maximum, though. That would alert the target, drawing its attention directly to her. Instead, she kept the aircraft steady, using small adjustments to maintain a pace just fast enough to stay within visual range while not giving away her position. Each movement of the control stick was deliberate, calculated. She was in control, but every second felt like it brought her closer to a confrontation she wasn't fully prepared for. Her eyes flicked to the radar again, scanning the return signals, ensuring that her positioning kept her out of the enemy's line of sight. As she approached a narrow valley, she angled the aircraft to hug the terrain, letting the rising ridges shield her from any potential radar sweeps. The unknown aircraft was still ahead, but Jessie couldn't risk a direct visual approach just yet. The risk of it seeing her first was too great. If it was an enemy fighter, the last thing she needed was to alert it to her presence before she was in a position to strike. Jessie's breathing remained steady, though her heart rate had increased slightly. She knew this was the moment where everything could change. There were no second chances in situations like this. She needed to make sure her movements were perfect, that every decision was precise. She kept her focus locked on the target, her hands moving instinctively as she adjusted her altitude again, dropping just below a ridge that would provide more cover. She could hear the engines of the F-15E roaring, almost drowning out the soft clicking of switches as she adjusted the radar. Sweep to a narrower band, her hand brushed against the control panel, flicking a switch to change her communication settings. She checked the radio frequency, still silent. No one had noticed her deviation from the mission's original flight path. If they did, they hadn't said anything. The mission was ongoing, but Jessie knew she was alone in this moment. If she was wrong, it would be her responsibility. If she was right, it would be her discovery, her triumph. She couldn't afford to be wrong. The target was getting closer now, its movements more predictable. It had made a slight turn to the east, dipping below the next ridgeline. Jessie followed, staying in perfect formation behind it. Still hidden by the terrain, her fingers adjusted the throttle again, keeping the speed just below the threshold of detection. The terrain below moved quickly, the valleys giving way to more open spaces. She could see the outline of the target more clearly now, but it was still a shadow against the bright sky. Her eyes darted between her instruments and the horizon, ensuring she didn't lose track of it. Suddenly, the unknown aircraft made a sharp climb, shooting upwards at an angle that threatened to break its cover. Jessie's reflexes kicked in, her hand moving instinctively to adjust the F-15E's altitude. The jet responded immediately, shifting slightly upward to avoid being caught in the climb's wake. She watched as the target continued its ascent, not once looking back to check if it had been followed. Jessie knew she had to make a decision. If she waited too long, it might escape. If she moved too soon, it could be ready for her. Her mind raced through the possible outcomes. A direct engagement was still not an option. She wasn't cleared for combat, but she couldn't allow the aircraft to slip past her. The risk was too great. Jessie gripped the controls, her palms sweating as she weighed the options. The unknown aircraft was still climbing, but it wasn't pulling away. She had it within range. Her eyes flicked to the HUD. There was no need to lock onto it yet. The aircraft wasn't aggressive, not yet. But the moment it showed signs of being hostile, she would have to act, and quickly. Jessie adjusted her flight path again, now following the aircraft's ascent in a sharp climb of her own. The F-15E groaned under the strain, but Jessie kept her grip firm, guiding the jet with precision. She could feel the pressure of the maneuver, the G-forces pushing against her chest as the aircraft shot higher. The unknown plane continued to climb, but Jessie stayed just behind it, staying close enough to maintain visual contact but far enough to avoid detection. The gap between them was closing, but Jessie wasn't ready to make her move yet. She needed to wait for the perfect moment, for the exact right angle to strike. Her focus was razor sharp, her heart pounding in her chest. She was aware of every sound in the cockpit, every minor vibration of the aircraft. This was the moment that would define everything. She couldn't afford to rush it. As the unknown aircraft leveled off, Jessie adjusted her angle, readying herself for the final move. She was in position. The target was still unaware of her presence, its attention focused elsewhere. With a deep breath, Jessie moved the control stick just slightly, adjusting her flight path for the final phase of the chase. She was ready to engage, to confront the unknown, but only when the time was right. The adrenaline surged as she prepared to close the distance, knowing that this moment could change everything. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The unknown was no longer a threat waiting in the distance. It was here, right in front of her, and she would face it, no matter what. The F-15E's wheels touched down on the frozen runway with a soft screech, the thrum of the engines gradually fading as she brought the jet to a stop. The base was eerily quiet, its usual hum of activity absent, as if holding its breath. Jessie powered down the aircraft, the familiar sequence of switches and dials clicking into place as the engines wound to a halt. There was no fanfare, no ground crew rushing forward to congratulate her or even acknowledge her. Return? The routine continued, as it always did. She unstrapped herself from the harness, feeling the weight of the mission lift off her shoulders. But the silence around her felt heavier than ever. The feeling of accomplishment was there, but it was muted, swallowed by the stillness of the moment. She climbed out of the cockpit, her boots crunching against the icy ground as she stepped onto the tarmac. The aircraft was now just another machine, parked and waiting for the next mission, its power dormant for the time being. Jessie glanced at the flight line, seeing the other jets lined up, their engines now idle. She could hear the distant chatter of the crew, but it wasn't directed at her. They were preparing for the next set of drills, oblivious to her contribution. She knew that no one would remember what had just happened, that her actions would fade into the background like so many others. There would be no celebration, no applause, just the routine, and she would slip quietly back into the shadows once again. As she walked back to the hangar, the cold air cut through her jacket, but it didn't bother her. The wind had always been a part of this place, and over time, she had grown used to it. Her footsteps echoed in the emptiness, but the sound didn't seem to reach anyone. She passed by the maintenance crews, who didn't acknowledge her presence, their attention focused on their work. It was as if she was just another part of the background, a quiet observer in a world where the spotlight was reserved for others. But Jessie knew better. She had seen something that no one else had, and she had acted on it. That was enough. The door to the command building creaked open as she entered. The air inside warm compared to the chill outside. She walked down the hall toward the briefing room, her eyes scanning the empty space. Colonel Rohr was standing by the door, his attention momentarily diverted by the mission logs. He looked up as she approached, but there was no surprise in his expression. He simply glanced down at the file in his hand and signed it with a quick, fluid motion. Dagger 3, he muttered, his voice a low murmur, as he slid the log back toward her. Jessie took the document without a word, her fingers brushing against the paper as she folded it and slid it into her jacket, the call sign she had carried for so long, now reinstated. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but to her, it meant everything. It was the recognition she had been denied for so long, and it held a weight that no one else would ever understand. Her name was back on the roster, her place in the mission affirmed, even if the rest of the world would never see it. She turned to leave the command building, the quiet weight of the day settling over her. The mission had been completed, the anomaly she had tracked was neutralized, and the operation had gone smoothly, but none of that mattered to the others. They would move on, their attention already on the next task. Jessie would be forgotten once again, just as she always had been. And yet, as she walked back toward her quarters, there was a sense of peace that settled in her chest. She had done the right thing. She had acted when no one else would, and that was enough. The hallway leading to her quarters was dark, the faint light from the overhead lamps casting long shadows against the walls. Her boots echoed in the quiet, each step taking her further away from the mission, but closer to something deeper. The weight of the mission log in her pocket, the quiet recognition of her efforts, felt like a secret she carried with her, one that no one else could see. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Jessie reached her door and pushed it open, stepping into the dimly lit room. She closed the door behind her and tossed her jacket on the chair, sinking into the bed with a sigh. The quiet of the room wrapped around her, but it wasn't the same as the silence of the base. This silence was hers. She had earned it, had worked for it in a way that no one else could understand. The mission was over. The world outside would keep turning, and she would return to the background. But this time, she didn't mind. Her hand brushed against the mission log tucked in her pocket, and for a moment, she let herself feel the weight of it. The recognition wasn't loud or grand, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, Jessie allowed herself to feel a quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had done something that mattered. No one else might ever acknowledge it, but she knew, and that was all that mattered.